This is The Express with Gary Allen, your 360-degree view of the world. Now, here's your host, Gary Allen.
And here's Gary.
Oh, hey, everybody. Welcome to The Express. This is Gary Allen. Most of you are probably listening somewhat to the World Series as well as listening to this particular program. We have a very, very good guest for you tonight, Mr. Richard Greenberg. We'll get to Richard in just a couple of minutes. I know he's on the line. For those of you that want to keep track of what's going on with me and how to get a hold of me, you can always go to my Facebook page. It's Gary Allen, A-L-A-N. You can go to my YouTube account, youtube.com/Gary Allen. Now, here's something I just found out. It's Gary Allen, A-L-L-A-N, The Express Interviews. Apparently, they don't recognize the single A-L-A-N. Oh, well. And on Thursday nights at 7 o'clock, this program repeats itself on diversitybroadcastnetwork.com, as well as progressivevoices.com. Go to their demand channel or their app, and you'll be able to scroll down, and depending upon what date that they put this up, which will probably be Friday or Saturday, you'll be able to listen to this program again. And tunein.com, if you subscribe to that with TMV, you'll be able to listen to not only this show, but all the programs on TuneIn. And we certainly hope you do that with all our other shows on the network. Tonight's guest is Richard Greenberg. Richard is an emotionally intelligent, successful team builder, communicator, salesman, corporate executive, patented inventor, college-level instructor. He's a published author, blogger, songwriter with 35 years of expertise in the digital distribution, post-production, and entertainment marketing industry. He was vice president in creative affairs for Electric Ideas, a small creative service company that provided all promotional material for the launch of DirecTV, Fox Sports, and various other clients. Richard is also currently working on a brand new book, which is How to Live with a Woman, Things I've Learned from My Wife. And that's got to be interesting enough. We'll get into that as well. Richard has written a wonderful, wonderful book. It's called Raising Children That Other People Like to Be Around, which is why he is here tonight, and that's why we have him on board the program. Richard, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Gary. Great to be here.
Probably like you, I was keeping track of what's going on with the World Series, although you're out in the left coast. So I want my Cubs to win, even though I'm not really from Chicago. I lived there for a lot of years, but I'd like to see the Cubs win. Richard, where did the title for this book come from? Raising Children That Other People Like to Be Around. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, it is a fantastic read. If you have infants or teenagers or whatever the case may be, this is a great book. Also, it's 5 common sense musts from a father's point of view. This is strictly from Richard's point of view. And as I found out last week, Mr. Greenberg and I have a lot in common in the show business world. And so we got to know each other a little bit on that. But where did the title come from?
You know, my wife and I were sitting at home one evening and we were talking about, well, what is the purpose of raising children? I mean, what is the goal? And we sort of deduced that it was to raise kids that other people like to be around, and of course that we like to be around. But I think we'd been at a restaurant and there were some kids misbehaving, and we just said to ourselves, why? Why would they let their child behave that way? And ultimately my wife said, I don't think they know what to do. They're just stuck. They just don't believe they have the skill. They don't believe they know, how to apply their expectations. And so we decided raising children that other people like to be around was the goal, and that the way to do that was to lead them and set an example for them that makes them likable. So it sort of led to a whole set of things that ultimately led to my writing the book, which was creating an owner's manual for those parents who didn't know what to do about their ill-behaved children.
It's a great book. It's an easy read. It's a fun read. You find yourself as you're going through the different chapters saying, I remember my mother and father kind of thinking that or doing that. But it really is. I mean, I hate to build on this too much, but it really is common sense things that you and your wife came to as far as decisions were to be made on how you were going to raise your children, what to do, that most of us probably take for granted that we have within our grasp or within our control. And that's what I really enjoyed about the book. I read it while I was at the radio station. I shouldn't have been doing that, but I was reading it while I was at the radio station.
Well, I think that, what I've noticed is that a lot of people look for answers to behavior or learning from the internet or from books these days in a way that, they're conditioned to look for some kind of guidance. Mm-hmm. And this guidance, I just decided that there's a lot of stuff that was common sense to you and me that might not be common sense to our children. So what I tried to do was I tried to carry over the values that my parents had taught me that I think are universal values into the expectations of my children, so that when they have children, they'll have those same expectations of their children. And that has to do with, like, telling the truth, respecting other people, taking responsibility, and being grateful. So if you can impose those concepts on your children, mm-hmm. then they carry them with them, and those are the concepts ultimately that lead to your children being likable, I think. So I observed how we were parenting. I observed how other people were parenting, and I saw, after a while you begin to observe that the children you've watched grow up have certain habits of their parents that those parents were worried about, like, oh, my kid's a musician, he's never going to straighten out. And then, 8 years later, the kid's in law school and is doing great, and that parent's like, how did that ever happen? And I think it happens because we subliminally send our children messages about how they should behave and what it means to live in the world. And they pick those messages up, and even though they go on their own path to find their way to where they're going, they usually come back to the messages that we've given them. Yeah,
I had a very good friend of mine. He's been a friend of mine since we worked our early days in college. We worked for an airline at the Miami International Airport. And a couple of years ago when I was living in Las Vegas, he called me up. He said, hey, can I send my son to you for a while for the summer? Because I don't know what to do with him. And I said, what's the problem? And he explained to me what the problem was. And I said, don't worry about it. He's very quiet. He's very shy. He's a little arrogant right now. But you know what? He's going to be fine. At any minute, I expect him being arrested, though, for breaking into the Pentagon computer. That's how intelligent he is. Yeah. Well, he did straighten himself out. His girlfriend at the time didn't like him at all. The girlfriend is long gone, and he is a major player in a law firm here in Florida. He graduated with honors from the University of Florida. He graduated from law school with honors, and he works for the largest law firm in the state of Florida. And he already, after 7 years, has a corner office making more money than Rick and I will ever see in any lifetime. One thing I wanted to get to, though, Richard, because I was reading in my book, is I don't know if I told you this or not. My listeners are aware of this, but I'm a student of Kabbalah. Uh-huh. And I was reading one of the chapters today, and it talked about cause and effect. And that kind of came to mind with me with this discussion we're having tonight. How does that work along with some of the other principles that you have in this book, the 5 common sense? We're talking to Richard Greenberg, the author of Raising Children that Other People Like to Be Around. Richard, how does cause and effect work as you're raising children from an infant right up through their teenage adult years?
Well, it's interesting. I think that, one of the first things I list in my 5 most important things to do is to set an example. And if you set an example that is an honest and trustworthy example, mm-hmm. and you teach your child that lifestyle works for you and that you can be proud of yourself because you're honest and mm-hmm. you treat people with respect, then the effect of that is that they learn that happens for them too. And when they're little, you need to take the position that is, you may not behave disrespectfully toward me. You may not behave disrespectfully toward anyone. This mm-hmm. is how we live in the world. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, there are a lot of parents who are afraid to impose that expectation on their child. But the bottom line is that if you impose that on your child begins to understand that, and then, as was the case with our children, they're uncomfortable with kids who are disrespectful. And mm-hmm. so part of what I was going to say to you about your friend's kid who was going to come live with you in Vegas is,
Right.
if your kids are hanging out with other good kids, or they make good choices with their friends, or you see them do responsible things, I don't think you need to worry if their hair is blue, or they're too shy, or they're listening to crazy music, because they will ultimately find the path. So in that cause and effect, the cause is love, okay? And the effect is happiness. And when you love your children, and loving them doesn't mean letting them do everything they want. Loving them means caring about how they're going to grow up. Then if you care about them and they perceive that you care about them and they know that what you're telling them is in their best interest because you remind them of that, then at the end of the day, they feel loved and they're positive, happy people, and they can talk to you about how they feel because they know you're not judging them. You're just guiding them.
Right.
And I think that guiding them is a very good way to look at parenting, because if they get off the trail, you need to bring them back onto the trail because it's safer for them. They don't know what's on the side of the road. You need to show them where the roads are.
We talked also last week about the word smart.
Yeah.
And responsibility and respect and truth, which you've hit on here a little bit. But let's talk a little bit about the word smart in the context in the book that you're referring to.
So in the context of my book, I took the word smart and I made it the points of parenting, which is set an example, make the rules, apply those rules, respect yourself, and teach in everything that you do. And so when you're setting an example, it doesn't mean just set an example in the way you behave, but it doesn't hurt when you put away the shopping cart and you hold doors for people and you're very sweet. But it also means take a look at the example that was set for you. How did your parents treat you? So that when you're parenting, you have to sit down with the person with whom you're parenting and say, what did your parents do that you really liked? And what did your parents do that you didn't like? How are we going to repeat the things that we both liked that our parents did? And how are we going to avoid doing the bad things our parents did? And then once you've determined what your rules are and your values are, in other words, I want our children to tell the truth. I want our children to be comfortable enough to tell us the truth when they do something wrong and teach them how to take responsibility. So what are my rules going to be? And is making your bed every day a rule that applies to those values? Maybe not. Maybe they don't have to make their bed every day. Although, maybe I want them to be very neat. So, once you decide your values, you then decide what you want to impose on them by way of structure so that they learn your values. And by the way, my parents were really hot about me making my bed every day. And, some days I did and some days I didn't, but it was always a bone of contention. By the time I was old enough to live on my own, of course I made my bed every day. I didn't want people to think I was a slob because I was raised in a house where there weren't slobs.
Right.
And by setting that example, my parents taught me to not be a slob. But when I was a kid, I was lazy, and I think, there were more important things to bother me about than whether my bed was made. It was just one of those things that used to make me roll my eyes like, oh, man, what do you guys care about that so much for?
Yeah, I'm glad my parents made me make my bed every day. As a matter of fact, my father, being an ex-Marine, said someday making your bed every day is going to pay off. It did in basic training in the Air Force, and that's about the only time it ever did. So I at least learned how to do it that way. You mentioned something that I'm glad you did. You talked about structure.
Yes.
And, it's amazing today when you talk to a lot of parents or you see a lot of parents out there, like you were talking about parents at the restaurant on not disciplining their children for misbehaving. You can understand a baby crying or something that happens. It happens on airplanes and every place else in public. But you talk about structure. How important is that? And there has to be a fine line between structure and just being too much discipline, because structure really is another word for discipline to a certain extent. But you can go overboard with that. So, Richard, if you could, even though it wasn't one of my original questions,
Yeah.
Talk to us about that. And we're talking to Richard Greenberg, author of Raising Children That Other People Like to Be Around. By the way, I can't wait till you finish the second book so I can have you back on, because knowing what I read about your wife in this book, I definitely want to find out more. You got to send me that book, man. I mean, when you get finished with it. But talk about structure and the fine line of structure as a child grows from infant to teenage years.
Okay, so I believe that children misbehave because they're anxious, because they don't know what's expected of them. And the best example I can give you that happens in our lives like this is when you go to McDonald's and there are 5 different lines, you always worry about whether you're in the line that's going to get there fastest. Oh, are those lines moving faster than mine?
Yes.
And when you go to the bank and they have like a velvet rope and everybody's in single file and the next person is next and there's an order to it, you can relax while you're in line because you know you're going to get your turn. It's fair. So I found that anxiety, like the difference between those two levels of anxiety, I sort of equated with my childhood in terms of if you know what your parents expect of you, then you can relax. If you behave within their expectations, which would be their rules, be home by sundown, sit at the table quietly, whatever those rules are, then you can reinforce yourself as a child and say, I'm a good boy. I'm behaving properly. I feel good. And what my wife brought to that conversation was not only can you yourself as the child reinforce it, but a parent who sees it should be going, I really like the way you're sitting at the table. I really appreciate it that you come home every night before sundown. I think it's great that you follow the rules. And that way the kid begins to like themselves. And genuine self-confidence is a very important thing to build in a child. Now, when they're 2 years old and they're testing your limits, that's not when you praise them for expressing their opinion by throwing their milk across the room. That's when you teach them not to throw their milk across the room. But, we have to make these decisions. I have an analogy that is, if you got into a taxi and you said to the driver, take me to the airport, and the driver said, I don't really know how to get to the airport. When you got in the back seat, you'd be like crazy. You'd be nervous. You'd be uncomfortable. Well, we are the drivers of the taxis in which our children are riding. And when our children are very young, they don't have enough information to tell us what streets we should turn on and what streets we shouldn't turn on. They should just be in the back seat and be confident that mommy or daddy knows exactly where they're going and that everything's going to be fine. And so what happens is, as your children get older and they try different things and try and tell you how to drive the cab, and you resist that, at some point in their lives, they get to a place where you can begin to listen to the instructions they give you. And at some point, sometimes you actually let them drive the cab. When they're older teenagers and they're making decisions for themselves and you think they're good at making decisions, you can say to them, you know what, I think you're old enough to drive the cab yourself. You can get yourself to the airport now. And that's the whole process of parenting, is teaching your children how to navigate the world by having them observe how you navigate it until such point as they are capable of navigating it on themselves, and you have given them your blessing in the way that they're going to go about doing that.
Right. We live in such an interesting times, an interesting world. I was going to have you define what a family is to you.
Yeah.
I know what a family is to me. It's loving people who love you, who set forth a good example for you. And I know that from a lot of people out there, the Christian right to whatever, or most people, I guess, think, the family is the wife and the husband. But we live in different times now, and it could be two mommies and it could be two daddies, or an aunt and an uncle, as I was raised for about 4 or 5 years of my life with an aunt and an uncle taking care of me. And they taught me discipline. They taught me how to behave. Now, I didn't always obey those rules. Talk about the importance of a family unit, whatever that may be to whomever is listening. It doesn't necessarily have to be a mom and a dad.
Right. So from a single mother to a gay couple to a number of people co-parenting, in my opinion, a family is a group of people who concerns itself with each other's well-being, that its parents, regardless of their gender, who care about how they're raising a child and who love that child and help supervise that child and cooperate with each other in the process of raising that child. And, I wrote a chapter, or it's not really a chapter, but it's a little segment in the book called What's a Mommy or a Daddy Anyway?
Yes.
And what's a mommy or a daddy anyway means, it basically the answer to that is you are. And you're not compared to anything else because your child only sees you as their parent. You are the definition of family or parent. And each of us has an opportunity to define what a family is for our own children. So in our case, we have a conventional marriage, and we have 3 boys and a girl. That's our family. I grew up in a family of 2 kids. I went away to boarding school when I was 13. My family was as much my friends as it was my parents, but my parents were a very influential part of my life, and I trusted them implicitly, and they never, my father was very strict with me, but I was going to say they never beat me or did something that was not in my interest, although my father was very mean, and he would say to me, I'm being mean to you because it's going to make you a better person. And, one of the things I evaluated in my own decisions about parenting was that an effective process with me? Did that work for me? And I thought, well, not necessarily. I'm not going to do that with my kids. But I am going to do something my dad did, which was whenever he got angry at me, he always apologized to me and explained why he had gotten angry. He always said, now, the reason that I sent you away from the dinner table tonight was because you were being rude, and we'd have a conversation about it. And I thought, well, that's a very fair thing to do. So there was always a follow-up with my kids when I got angry, and I think that helped them feel respected. And I think that caused us to be much more united as a family because we could talk with each other honestly. We also had dinner as a family on Friday nights. My wife said to me, you need to be home from the office at least one night a week for dinner, and we're going to have a family dinner on Friday night, and we're going to talk to our children, and we're going to teach them table manners, and we're going to teach them essentially that this unit right here is sacred, and that we trust each other. We do not talk about what happens at dinner with other people, and we always have each other's backs. And that was a way in which we built our family. Any group of people who is willing to make that commitment to each other and that commitment to a child is a family as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. We're talking to Richard Greenberg, author of Raising Children That Other People Like to Be Around, 5 Common Sense Musts from a Father's Point of View. And I loved, like I said, I loved the title and I loved reading the book. If you want, you can go to your website, I believe, also too, Richard, and purchase the book. It's on Amazon as well, right?
Yes. And if you do purchase the book, write a review for me, and I'm happy to hear whatever people have to say. My website is called CommonSenseDad.com,
Yes.
And Common Sense Dad sort of writes about various things. I try and stay away from politics. I generally stay focused on revelations about people and parenting. My wife and I are going to become grandparents in January, so that may lead to a whole other angle. But
There's another book.
Grandparenting. Yeah.
Yeah,
although from what I hear, it's pretty easy. I think you just show up, get the kid all riled up, and then leave them in the hands of the parents.
Yeah. It's like me being an uncle to so many nieces and nephews. It's like, hey, Uncle Gare, it's great to see Uncle Gare. And I go, yeah, hey, listen, it was nice seeing you kids. I'll see you later,
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
it's like, it's so much. By the way, you were talking about your wife insisting on you being there at least one night a week for the family dinner. And we talked a little bit about that phenomenon when we were on the phone. But I just want to tell you, because I forgot to tell you this last week, one of my dear friends who recently passed away was Richie Martin, Dean Martin's son.
Uh-huh.
And Richie and I talked once about the fact that Jeannie, who also passed away a few weeks after Richie, about 2 months ago, said, Dean, you need to be home when you're in town to have dinner with your children. And Richie said, my father was home every night. Now, during the day, he played golf and did whatever, but he was home every night having dinner with the children. And Richie said, I think that kept the family bond together. So I wanted to share that with you and with our listeners as well. But we talked about the family dinner. And
Right.
I said one of my reasons I love to watch Blue Bloods is because, well, it's a great show, but also at the end, it reminds me of the dinners I had with my family. There was 8 siblings besides myself and mom and dad, so it was
Wow.
great to yeah. Well, listen, the old statement in our house, my father used to say, is if there's something left on the plate, you either grab it now or it ain't gonna be there later. Grab it and growl, otherwise it's not going to be there.
Yeah.
But it reminds me of that, and I haven't had that in years. So, talk about the phenomenon that we talked about last week, about the percentages of kids who grow up with a better feel for themselves in the family world, based on the fact of something simple, just once a week having dinner together.
Well, yeah, there's actually, research on the value of family dinners, and it's like one of those, well, what are those rules? Um, the 5 things that successful people do, or whatever it is.
Right.
That one of the most consistent things that was discovered in quote successful people was that they had had family dinners when they were young. They had been part of a family dinner, and our kids. It's really interesting. There are 2 things that happened in our life. One of them was that my wife recognized that I was working every day for 12 hours a day, and I was just busting my butt. And she said to me, you need to, first she tried this. If you're not home for dinner, our kids won't know who their father is. And I responded to that by saying, of course they'll know who their father is. I'm their father, because that's the way I would respond to that.
Mm-hmm.
Then she tried a different tact. And she said to me, what time do you think you get home every night from work? And I remember that I used to listen to a radio drama that played from 8 to 9, or 8 to 8:30 and 8:30 to 9. So I said, well, I'm usually home between 8 and 8:30. And she said, no, I've kept this chart. She kept a chart. And, you get home, you average home at about 8:50. And like the kids are just going to bed, and that just doesn't work for me. So from now on, I want you home one night a week for dinner, and I want you to work one Saturday a month instead of every Saturday that month. And it was like,
Wow.
okay. And, part of my new book is the fact that men are really good at following directions. If you give men directions, they'll follow them. So she gave me directions, and I followed them. And then what happened is that Friday night dinner was so much fun that I would try to get home early for dinner on other nights, because sitting with our kids and listening to them talk about whatever it is they were thinking about was much better than sitting in my office hearing a client complain. So, it just became something I loved. And in those dinners, I learned, they learned how to trust each other. And then another thing happened, which was when Joanne, my wife, got pregnant with our 4th child, my mother said, you guys need help. I'm going to buy you dinner every Monday night. We're going to have dinner together. You bring your kids. Your sister will bring her kids. And so my mom hosted dinner for my sister and her 3 kids, and me and our 4 kids. And the cousins all got to bond with each other. In other words, it just became Monday night dinner. And Monday night dinner was like, if you wanted to bring a friend, you had to call Grandma and ask permission, and Grandma would always say okay. And so, they kept gathering the family is a very valuable thing to do, especially when your children are little. Last weekend, Halloween weekend, I have adult kids, 36, 32, 27, and 21. The 21-year-olds in Atlanta, the 3 boys who are the older, all have girlfriends. They all came over on Sunday, and they all carved pumpkins, which was just a ritual we've been doing with them since they were 10 years old.
That's
and
cool.
They still want to do that. Of course, their pumpkins are much better now. But, they're still connected to each other and connected to us as long as my wife cooks the things they like. They'll come over, and we'll see them. So I think these are really lasting connections that get made at those sorts of events, dinners, family meals, get-togethers, reunions, whatever. And so I can't promote that enough.
Yeah. And by the way, I believe you told me one of your sons is extremely successful producer in Hollywood.
He's at the very sort of, I'd say he's 50% of the way into his career. And they're all really moving along nicely, because I think part of success in business has to do with whether or not people enjoy working with you.
Yeah.
And they're conscientious people, but they're also polite people and sensitive to what's going on around them. And the entertainment industry is one where you really need to know when to keep your mouth shut and when somebody's interested in your opinion. And they've learned how to do that.
Yeah, I wish I had learned that lesson a long time ago when I was out there. It was a totally different thing. We're talking to Richard Greenberg, the author of Raising Children That Other People Like to Be Around, 5 Common Sense Musts for a Father's Point of View. Your wife ought to write one on a woman's point of view, too. I think that would be quite interesting. I would assume that would almost be a 180 from yours.
Yeah, it would probably be ignore, smack them on the side of the head. Ignore, smack them on the side of the head.
And use the rest of these pages as a daily diary. How much does faith play in raising a child to respect each other and, of course, respect yourself first and foremost before you can respect? It's like my grandmother used to say, in order to love or like someone else, you need to love or like yourself. Not ego love, not narcissistic, but just appreciate who you are. How much does faith play in this entire process of raising children?
So our Friday night dinners were Shabbat dinners. We're Jewish. I was raised by Jewish parents who lit candles on Friday nights, and we had a Shabbat dinner. And when we would have Shabbat dinner, I would say to our children, why are we kindling these Sabbath lights? And I scripted their response, and their response was to stop once a week and thank God for all the wonderful things we have in our lives. And if I were to ask any of them today, why do we kindle the Sabbath lights, they would say those exact words, which was one of those times when you don't want there to be any interpretation or any sort of looseness in this. This is why we're doing it, to stop once a week and thank God for all the wonderful things we have in our life.
Yeah.
Now, then we'd list some wonderful things. We'd appreciate each other. But I believe that the purpose of religion is to humble man, that the purpose of religion is for you to not think you're the coolest thing in the world, that there is some power greater than you that has no control, that you have no control over. I've lost 3 friends in the last, I'd say, 4 weeks, 59 years old, 68 years old, 72 years old, people I've worked with and who I really liked. And, it's just, there are things we can't control. And so in terms of faith, I think that part of it is accountability. Part of it is understanding that there is a force in the world that's greater than I am, and I need to be in awe of that, whatever that means. And so for my children, I think my children, the structure upon which we hang our beliefs happens to be Judaism. But I think that there are a lot of structures out there, and they all theoretically have the same values, which is we should value life, we should be courteous to other people, we should respect their religious beliefs. And I don't have a problem with that unless they want to try and tell me what I should actually believe, or that I have to believe what they believe.
Right.
So from my point of view, I think religion has played a very important part of helping my children have an identity. They are proud of their heritage. They know that their grandparents were immigrants who came from Russia. They know that we have relatives who fled the Holocaust. They are connected to their Jewish roots, and I think that's very important to them. And in that way, I think religion and faith really plays a big part in what you just described as what your grandma said, which is being able to love yourself, being able to understand what is that chain from which you come. And I think these things like 23andMe and all the genetic research stuff, I think that's so interesting and so amazing that people can now find out. The great story was the guy who, thought he was Cherokee Indian or something, and he turned out to be like Irish. Yeah. And, it was just hilarious. There are things that happen, but it really throws all of our preconceptions and prejudices on their ears when we find out that we're all made of the same stuff. And I'm hopeful that we can, as a world, sort of rise above all the petty ego crap that you mentioned and begin to recognize that, we can respect each other and still live in the world peacefully. It's just when somebody says, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that because my religion says you can't do it.
Yeah,
Things
yeah.
get messy.
That's the problem I have with the extreme religious right nowadays, pushing their feelings on if you don't think or do what I'm doing. And I'm not going to bring up politics, but around here in Central Florida, everything's Trump, 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 and just the thought of that alone, it makes me ill. But my grandmother always also said, "Remember where you come from. Remember who you are." I was very fortunate enough. My father was a captain for the airline, so I got to travel to Europe and Eastern Europe as a child. And of course, I'm an adopted child to begin with, and I got to go to Greece, where my birth parents were both from. And I got to wander around a little bit, but I also got to go and see where my father's parents, my stepfather and my stepmother, where they were from. And my stepmother was Jewish, and I found out my birth parents were Jewish, so that's why I'm of the Jewish faith, Christian by choice, but I still find myself adhering to the Jewish faith when it comes to a lot of things. When I was in the Air Force, I went to a rabbi more than I ever went to a priest, because the rabbi would speak from. But my grandmother said, "Remember where you come from, because that's always will be home to you." And I never really understood that until I got older. And I think that's kind of what you're saying, too. Remember who you are, where you come from, the people you come from, and that'll keep your feet planted on the ground.
Well, and I think that's one of our jobs as parents also, is to give our children that sense of continuity. I have a part of the book where I talk about cross-promotion,
Yes.
where I say to my kids, your mom is the greatest mom in the world. She's just so fun. Or, we are so lucky that your grandma, bought that for you. Or we're so lucky that grandma hosts us for dinner every Monday night. Just reminding them of the good things that they have in their lives so that they're not that thrown off by bad things. And also being the authority for them about issues. Like, if I came home from school and said to my parents, the United States is a mean country, and we put a lot of people in jail. My parents would say to me, "Where did you get that idea?" And then they would say to me, "This is how it works." And they would lay out for me the facts. And they respected me enough to spend the time to teach me what was real in life so that I could go back to my peer group, and when somebody spouted off about something really dumb, I could say, "No, you're wrong. This is how the facts are." We incarcerate, my parents were very scientific, so we incarcerate 13% of our population, whatever it is. But the fact is that they would arm me with information. And I think that education is a huge part of self-confidence. I think that, in other words, people get upset about participation trophies. They get upset about what they think is pretending that you've achieved something and rewarding children for things that they think are nothing. In my opinion, a participation trophy is a souvenir of having devoted yourself to being on a team for a season. It's a marker in time of a commitment you made and you kept. And I don't have a problem with it. But, I can understand how some people, if you say to your child, "You're a great baseball player," and the kid's never gotten a hit, you have to take your kid to the batting cage and teach them how to hit. That's what you do. You don't tell them they're a great baseball player. You help them become one. And if they're not going to become one, you say, maybe baseball's not your game. Yeah. So, it's up to us to be honest with our children, but there's a way to be honest without destroying their egos and without pretending to tell them things that make them feel good about themselves. Give them really real things to feel good about. I really like the way you practice your instrument. I really like the way you talk to the man at the market. It's so nice of you to look people in the eye. These are the things that you can reinforce that make your children understand that, my dad taught me how to shake someone's hand. He said, when you shake somebody's hand, you shake their hand with a firm grip and you look them in the eye. And I'm telling you, from the time I was 7 years old, I did that. And every time I did it, I felt good about myself because I was doing something I'd been taught how to do the right way. And that's what I think the job of a parent is. And that's, just more about, as we discussed, believing in yourself and having confidence and teaching your child, giving your child the tools they need to believe in themselves, not cutting them down, but helping them find the ways to succeed.
We're talking to Richard Greenberg, author of Raising Children That Other People Like to Be Around, 5 Common Sense Musts from a father's point of view. Richard, you talk about in chapter 1 how important it is for parents as their children grow to learn adaptability in today's world. Talk about that a little.
You know, it's so funny because somebody who I was telling the taxi cab analogy said to me just yesterday or the day before, well, what happens when they want to drive the cab? And that's what led me to explain it the way I explained it with you, which was, well, if you think they're ready to drive the cab, then they should certainly drive the cab. That it's, part of our job is to raise our children so that when they're old enough, 18 or 19 years old, you can kick them out of the nest and they're able to fly. That was what my mother always said. My job is to make sure you can fly when it comes time for you to leave the nest. And then I added to that, be able to fly in any kind of weather. So adaptability, here I am. I was born in the 1950s. When I was a kid, there were men everywhere. There were very few female doctors. There were very few females on television.
Yeah.
The whole world, the gay people didn't admit they were gay, and in fact, they were ostracized for being gay. The world was completely different. And so over these last 40 or 50 years, I've had to really sort of retrain my responses to things and learn that, that stuff was wrong and that a lot of it was ideal. I say to people, my relationship with black people when I was in high school was sort of, I know that black people and we're supposed to be equal, but there were 2 or 3 black people in my world. It wasn't like I had an opportunity to have those sorts of relationships because it didn't exist. Today in the workplace, everybody's there, blacks, Latinos, Asians, everybody, and everybody has equal levels of competence, and we are living in the idealized world that was sold to you and me as what was supposed to be. Now it is what it is, and I think it's very hard for a lot of people to get used to that. So as you look at your children growing up, and you see this little blob that didn't know how to go to the bathroom, you're raising up and has all these opinions that they share with you. At a certain point, when they're very young, you teach them how to respect you and that, what those limits are and how that relationship works. And then as they get older, you give them enough leeway to start making mistakes and learning on their own, and you recap lessons with them. Again, neither Joanne nor I drink very much, or basically at all. So when our children went out with their teenage friends, they always became the designated drivers because they weren't comfortable drinking. And their friends would get drunk and throw up, and they would come home and they'd just say, God, I don't get it. And, it was the same for us. Look, I'm not a saint. I don't try and portray myself as a saint, but I, for the sake of my children, made a point of teaching them what expectations we have of adult behavior. And, it's just, I think that that's sort of the key to the whole game. So if I have to adapt, when Emily would come home and she'd say that one of her friends was gay and it was a boy and he was in the 6th grade, I would say to her, come on, he's in 6th grade. Who knows if he's gay or not? And we would have that conversation, but I wouldn't make a value judgment about it.
Right.
And by the way, I sang in the UCLA Men's Glee Club. I was around gay people a lot, but it wasn't like it wasn't as comfortable as now having news items in People magazine where so-and-so and his husband are raising their child. Again, we come back to what the definition of a family is. People who love the child they're raising and who take the responsibility for doing the job. So I'm not going to judge people. But I am going to say, if your children don't behave, you're not doing a good job. And that brings me back to, we are judged by the behavior of our children, and we should be aware of that, and we should teach our children to behave as a result.
Right. In chapter 1, the backstory, you talk about, I think it's at that point, you talk about the time your son got in your automobile and was horsing around and locked himself in, couldn't get him out. But the analogy that you made at the end was that when something goes wrong, and even if your children aren't involved or are involved, you should handle it by not panicking. Don't get angry. have the ability to laugh at yourself, and then later sit down with your child or not and explain what is going on here. You smashed the window. And what happened was Richard's son got caught in the automobile. They couldn't unlock the
No,
doors.
He buckled himself into his car seat. We were washing the car, and he was on the inside, and I was on the outside. And like, little kids, they like to play around in the car. So I had the windows up because I was hosing the car off, and he bounced around, and he locked the car doors, and it was like, ha, 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 that's really funny. And then he got into his car seat, and he clipped himself in, and the child-proof clip held him in place. Yeah. So it was a hot day, and he was beginning to steam up, and I just realized that I had no choice but to go in the house and get a hammer and break my car window and get him out of the car. And I just had to laugh at the circumstance. And most importantly, my wife got home, and she just said, I can't believe you let him lock himself in the car. But we didn't have a fight about it. Neither one of us was an idiot. It was just certain things happen that you can't control. And you hit on it when you said, you have to be able to laugh at yourself. You have to be able to say, not everybody does this job perfectly. Nobody's a perfect parent. It's just about trying to get through it with more victories than losses.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the 5-5-20 formula.
Well, basically, when you decide that your child is doing something that's really upsetting you, and you are not going to embarrass them, but you are going to lower the boom and tell them that they can't go to the party because you told them that they had to have their homework done before they went to the party and the homework isn't done, and now you're going to live up to your word by saying, sorry, you're staying home. For 5 minutes, they'll hate you, and then in 5 days, they will have forgotten about it, and in 20 years, they'll thank you.
Yeah.
And that's basically what happens is that, you have to make decisions that are hard sometimes. Your children are going to be really angry at you, and then it's going to roll off their back, even though you think it's a really big deal, and you're going to completely forget about it. And then when they're parenting their own children, they're going to say, I just want you to know I really appreciate that you taught me that lesson when I was a kid. And I can tell you, I wrote my mom a bunch of notes that were thanking her for her having taken various moral stands. And in fact, I think there's a piece in the book about my mom who, at one point told me I couldn't ride my bike more than 3 blocks away. And I had a friend over, and I asked if we could go 5 blocks, and she said no. And then the next week when he came over, she came up to me before the discussion came up, and she said, I thought about that, and I thought, you've been really a good boy about this. So you can ride the 5 blocks now if you want. If you guys want to go 5 blocks, you can. And it showed me that she was paying attention, and she was thinking about me. And before I had to ask her again, she had proactively extended my range.
See, I guess that goes back to the old adage, the more you listen to your parents, the more they trusting of you, the more distance, the more rope, as my father used to say, I'll give you so you can hang yourself,
Yeah, exactly.
In your book, you also talk about not only rules, but you also talk about consistency. And I would suppose that would be a very common sense thing, consistency, whatever the discipline is. I know that in my household, my father would not spank us, although I did get taken to the woodshed a couple of times when I deserved it. But my father's discipline was taking something away from you that you enjoyed. If it was the TV, or I guess nowadays it would be like a computer or iPad or whatever the case may be. But you also talk about rules. So talk about the consistency of raising a child and rules that need to be set for children. And also, and then we'll get into parents who make excuses for their children that I really want to hit on.
I think something really important is teaching your children to tell the truth and teaching your children to own up when they've made a mistake. And one of the things that my parents did that I thought was admirable and that I repeated with our children was that they invented a thing. Well, they didn't invent it. My father was a lawyer. My mother was a psychotherapist, which I, by the way, didn't know until after she passed away, and I was going through her stuff.
Really?
But, yeah, she didn't practice. She worked. She volunteered at things, but they had a thing that was called an armistice, which was a truce. And if I did something dumb, and in a particular case, I was playing with an airplane in our living room, and I threw my little toy airplane, and it bumped into like a piece of crystal that fell over and broke. And so I went to my parents and I said, can I have an armistice? And an armistice meant that they would listen to my story and that they couldn't punish me in anger, that they had to listen to my story and then we would discuss it. So I was playing with my airplane and I broke the crystal thing in the living room. And so my mother, the tribunal of my mother and father would say, well, so what's wrong with that picture? I'd say, well, I shouldn't be playing with my airplane in the living room. And they go, that's right. And then they would say, and what do you think an appropriate punishment would be? And I would say, well, I'll take out the trash every day for the next 8 years. And they said, well, you're supposed to take out the trash anyway, so that doesn't count. And then my mother would say, why don't you wash your father's car this weekend and next weekend? And I'm like, okay. So their penalty was always less terrible than my penalty. And then that would be it. That would be what would happen if I did something wrong. And it taught me that I could go to the grown-ups and I could say, okay, before I get in trouble because you've discovered this, I'm going to cop to it and I'm going to explain why it happened, and maybe you'll have mercy on me. And they did. And it taught me how to tell the truth. And I thought that was a very, very, very valuable parenting tool. And we did that with our kids so that they could admit their mistakes. And my mom caught me playing with fire once, and she just said to me, look, I expect you to play with fire. You're a boy. You're an idiot. If you're going to play with fire, have a bucket of sand nearby, have a hose nearby, and be ready to put it out if it gets out of control. And if you want to play with it in a fireplace where it's designed to be played with. I get that you like to light matches. So, there are ways to teach your children that they can trust you that extend into all parts of your life. And to this day, when our kids have a problem, they're willing to talk about it with us. There's no, what I like even more is they already counsel with each other before they talk to us. And that part of it's entertaining. I talk to.
Yeah, it's amazing when you were saying that, because I often think that nowadays when somebody does something wrong, whether it be in the workplace or in the political arena or out in life, isn't it amazing how they try to cover it up with another lie, and that even makes it even worse than what the original sin was to begin with?
Yes, and that really is ultimately, without getting political, brings us back to the character of one of the candidates that we have, which is cannot accept blame.
No, he never does anything wrong. Talk about parents who make excuses for their children. And boy, I ran across that quite a bit. We're talking, of course, to Richard Greenberg, Raising Children That Other People Like to Be Around. He's the author of this book, and he's going to be back with me after the first of the year. I can guarantee you that, providing he wants to come back. But talk about parents who make excuses for their children. We've got about 6 minutes left, so we got plenty of time.
So the expression I came up with for this was, the more excuses you make for your child, the more excuses you will make for your child. So, and it starts with, the baby doesn't like the color blue, or our baby is afraid of dogs, and believe me, I understand that babies can be afraid of dogs, but that doesn't mean somebody has to put their dog away. It means let's teach our baby not to be afraid of dogs. If your dog is a wonderful, friendly dog, let's take advantage of that opportunity. But what happens is that you make these excuses, and you end up making lots of excuses because your child picks up on the fact that they've trained you to make an excuse for them. So, well, he misbehaves. I'm sorry, my son likes to run around in circles and scream because it makes him feel good. It's like, well, yeah, but it's not okay. It's not acceptable. And so at some point somebody has to say that, and that comes down to teaching your child. Then it's the parent's responsibility. There's a story in my book about a kid who's on a moon bounce at the school carnival, and the mom keeps making excuses for the kid that's on the moon bounce and isn't willing to get the kid out of the moon bounce so that my kid and other kids can get into the moon bounce. Right. And it's kind of like, how long are you going to let that child boss you around? And it really comes down to, I find that some parents project what they feel into their children and use that as an excuse for how their children behaves. Meaning, she's really nervous about going to kindergarten today. Well, what do you mean she's really nervous about going to kindergarten? She's never been to kindergarten. If you believe she's nervous about it, you're going to make her nervous about it. And that brings us back to, what you mentioned earlier, which is panic. It's like there's no place for panic in parenting. There's no, your children will believe what you teach them to believe. They'll be calm if you're calm. If your child falls down and scrapes their knee, and you say, "Oh, whoops, you scraped your knee," and you wipe it off and you give it a kiss and you say, "All clean, go play," they'll do that. If they fall down, they scrape their knee, and you go, "Oh my God, your knee! Are you okay?" They're going to cry. In my own life, I was batting in Little League. I was 9 years old. I was a little kid. I was up to bat. The pitcher threw a ball. It was sort of headed at me. The only part of my body that was covered was my head because I had on a batting helmet. So I leaned my head into the ball hit the helmet, and I got first base for free. I was ecstatic about it, okay? But as I'm running down to first base, all these parents leave the bleachers, and they're leaning on the fence, and they're yelling, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And the coach is running out of the dugout, and he's all concerned. By the time I got to first base, I was crying. And I was crying because all those people expected me to be crying, not because I was hurt. And I learned about, that was something I learned about parenting right then and there, was if you expect your child to be hurt, if you expect your child to cry, if you expect your child to be messy, they'll be all those things. And it's our job as parents to let them know what we expect and sometimes to hide our own concern. The first time you see your child's blood, that's scary. When your kid has a fever and you can't control it, that's scary. But you can't let yourself be scared. You have to be the bigger person. You have to be the grown-up, and you have to kind of go, everything's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. Whether you know that or believe that doesn't matter. Your job is to keep that child calm and to let them know that you're getting them help as quickly as you possibly can. Because if you're screaming and crying, I promise you they'll be screaming and crying.
Well, I never got that sympathy stuff. I had an older brother who, by the time I was 10, was already playing for the Baltimore Colts. So he had already been through all the bruises, breaks, and everything. So I really didn't get a lot of sympathy. That'll clean up. Put a Band-Aid on it. You'll be fine. Richard, we got a couple of minutes left here, about 3 minutes to go. Let's talk about what is it that you want people to take away from this wonderful, wonderful book. And we've been talking to Richard Greenberg, Raising Children that Other People Like to Be Around, 5 Common Sense Musts from a Father's Point of View. Please get it on Amazon. You can go also to Common Sense. What is it?
CommonSenseDad.com.
Yeah, and go there, get the book, read it. It's just a great read. It's an easy, funny read. You can do it in one afternoon, or you can not. But what is it that you want people to take away from this book?
I want people to know that whether they believe it or not, they are equipped to be good parents. And that, as parents, you know everything you need to know in order to raise a child. If you've been a child, you've been a child. There's no question about it. So you have to examine your own feelings and how you have grown up and what lessons you've learned. And then you have to try and figure out ways to teach those things to your children. And you have to have the confidence to believe that you know what you're doing. And I promise you that you know more than your child does about everything. And at a certain point, certainly from ages maybe 1 to 7 or 1 to 8, you're the world to them. And to be aware that you're their world and to pay attention to them and to look them in the eye and to have a relationship with them, I think is so much more important than, it turns out. It's much more important than your job, more important than your car, more important than anything else that you have going on is the relationship that you can build with your child. And as a result, it is not a burden. It doesn't become an obligation. It becomes a pleasure. And so, when I say to you that my kids come over to carve pumpkins, it's hilarious when they're over. They're funny. They're people they're adults that I like, and they have perspectives about politics. They have perspectives about the world. They're big hockey fans. It becomes a world that is very fun to populate. And so I would say to people, keep it simple. Parenting is not a profession. It's not complicated. It's really a matter of providing for your children, helping them feel secure, letting them know you love them, telling them everything's going to be all right, letting them know you're there, their house is there, that you love them. I often say to divorced parents, you're not behind the eight ball with your child. You've done something and you've changed your circumstance, but you're still the dad. The mom's still the mom. You can't control your ex-spouse's behavior. You can only control the relationship you have with your child. So all of us has our own relationship with each of our children, and in some cases, like my marriage, they relate to both my wife and me in different ways, but they know that we're communicating with each other. And in divorced families, it's a whole other set of ways in which your children have to adapt. But they do adapt. Nothing is fatal in your relationship with a child unless you're just downright mean. And then it's really your problem.
We've been talking to Richard Greenberg, author of Raising Children That Other People Like to Be Around, 5 Common Sense Musts from a Father's Point of View. Richard, thank you so much for being with us tonight on The Express. I'm going to have you back after the first of the year at some point, I guarantee you, because I also want to hear about the other book. But thank you for taking a few minutes out of your day to be with us tonight.
Sure. Thank you, Gary. Take care.
And give your wife my best, because I can't wait to have her version of the book on here too.
Yeah, she's pretty awesome. Okay.
Yeah, she is.
And she's
great.
a Cubs fan.
Yeah, they're leading 7-2 in the bottom of the 7th, so I'm excited about that. Thank you, Richard. God bless. I'll talk to you in a couple days.
Okay, Gary. Take care.
You got it. And for those of you that are following us, you can get me on Facebook at Gary Allen, ALAN, YouTube.com, Gary Allen with 2 L's, The Express Interviews. Thursday night at 7 p.m. on Diversity Broadcast Network. This program repeats itself. On Friday, it'll be up on progressivevoices.com. Go to their demand channel or their app. You can get it there. And, of course, tune in as always. Next week, we won't be with you because it's a political evening. It's the presidential election, and I'm going to be out doing something for the radio station. But on behalf of all of us here at TMV Cafe and on behalf of all of us at The Express, I just want to thank you all for taking a few minutes out of your day to join us. I know you have a lot of other things you can do with your evening, but each and every week, Randy and all of you who constantly tune in and listen to this program, thank you very much. I couldn't do it without you. So until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.
You've been listening to The Express with Gary Allen. Join us here every Tuesday night at 10 for more captivating talk with Gary Allen. See you next time on The Express.